honoured to have Sonja come and give us a talk around what's going on critically in the other side of the world, in the field of infrastructure, the area of our interest. If you had the occasion to read very quickly her impressive brief bio, you will see that Sonja is very much a person who is involved in practice and transfers ideas into academic thinking and vice versa, and I couldn't but support people of this ilk. Too often, even though I'm in an academic institution here, the divisions between academia and practice are far too deep. The divides are problematic, but that's another subject. We're not going to focus on one here today. We're going to focus on what's going on in terms of the Australian picture, in terms of infrastructure investment, and the role of infrastructure, critical role of infrastructure, national regional development and productivity and competitiveness. Before we ask someone to start, I wonder if you'd be good enough, as we do normally, go around the table to introduce ourselves just very quickly about who we are, where we're from, and what sort of course or what research area we're involved in. So perhaps ladies first.
Hi everyone, I'm April from China. I'm doing master's degree here. I'm an infrastructure planning with Harvard University.
I'm Brian Garcia. I'm originally from California, and I'm a PhD student studying transportation and redevelopment.
My name is Julian Chain. I write a website called Games Monitor on the Olympics.
Dan Durant, I'm a PhD student at the ME Centre.
I'm studying the pregnancy system and awareness. Came from China. So Japan.
Japan.
That's a big difference.
Hi, my name is Warren.
Globalisation.
My name is Warren Lansana. Parents originally from Sierra Leone. I study architecture first year in London Southwark University.
Robin Hinkman, I'm a lecturer in Bartlett on transport planning, and previously a consultant with Halcro, so interesting to see how you've managed the crossover.
I'm John Ward, I'm a research fellow from the ME.
I'm Will Hicks. I am an alumni from the MSc in Imperial at UCL. I also work at Transport for London, and I'm also an Australian. About 8 years ago.
I got that.
Yeah.
Chris Wright. I'm doing a master's in economic development at the development planning unit at UCL.
Thank you.
Okay, should I switch around the lights off, or will we be okay like that?
Well, if you can turn them down a bit.
Whilst Harry's turning them down, I've been asked to cover a really small subject area, Australian infrastructure. So I hope you'll bear with me, because what I've found is that as I go into it, I have more questions than I have answers. So that's been my experience. Some years ago, I went to the Australian National University and met with a colleague of mine who headed up the macroeconomic analysis unit at ANU Canberra University. And he was also on the Reserve Bank Board. And it was just at a time when there was all this big spend on infrastructure being discussed. And we said, do we really know what we are doing in the infrastructure area when we're engaging in this massive spend? So what we decided to do was to bring together a group of people who we thought were the leading academics and practitioners in the infrastructure area. And so we had a gathering in 2010, and then a follow-up in 2011 at the Brookings Institute in Washington. And the outcome of that, and some of my references are back to that forum, is that we really need a research agenda to better inform the decision makers and to get a closer alignment between policy and politics and productivity objectives that we have. So, you'll note from my topic title here that I put a question mark, because it's easy to take a very partial point of view and say, here is the transformational effect of major infrastructure. But the positives and negatives and the net gains, I think, is still a big question mark as to what role infrastructure has played in terms of Australia's productivity, competitiveness and overall well-being. And part of that is because we haven't done a lot of the post-evaluation of projects that we need to do to understand what the consequences really are, what was anticipated and actually what occurred. So, first of all, just quickly looking at what are the theoretical attributes of infrastructure and how do we actually consider those in practice. Now, we call it economic infrastructure, so whether it's energy, water, transportation, ports, airports and the like, it's supposed to contribute positively to national economies, to the well-being of a nation. Yet, when we look at some of the work that Louis Sablin did with the World Bank, he found that there are major flaws in measurement that American researchers such as Ashula had developed in 1989, where he anticipated or projected that there were very significant gains, whereas Sablin has raised a question based on far more rigorous research whether those gains actually do occur. Infrastructure is not a public good. A public good in the economic sense being a good whose production or consumption affects everyone else regardless, such as air quality, water quality. It's a collective good. And there's as much evidence of government failure as there is market failure in this area. Recently, on all our projects, whether it's in Australia or here, we talk about agglomerative economies, specialisation and competition that investment in infrastructure stimulates. Yet the major flaw is that we have selective measures and we say it will benefit this particular area rather than addressing the overall net gains, the redistributive effects. Infrastructure certainly has monopolistic characteristics, and there's a question as to whether our regulators really have the mechanisms and who is regulating the regulator when they determine price caps or cost of service, etc. So there are real problems for regulators as to how they set the price of infrastructure service in the case of regulated assets. With infrastructure, you always have multiple and potentially competing objectives in terms of social objectives vis-à-vis economic objectives and cross-subsidisation and community service obligation. Infrastructure, we know, unlike building a house or a major commercial centre or a major redevelopment project, is very lumpy and it has lock-in pathways that affect the future for a whole set of other systems. And because they are long-term lock-in pathways, there are significant questions about forecasting and regulatory uncertainty. There are also free riders in infrastructure where, as we know in transport, accessibility is a prime determinant of urban form competition for land. Yet it is a free rider. When you spend all the money on infrastructure and providing a railway station, there are rent seekers, namely those property owners in the surrounding area, that are getting a free ride on that investment. There's also a problem, because of the lumpiness of the investment, with mega projects, that the more complex and larger they are, the greater the uncertainty. So that's just to begin. There is a seductive power around infrastructure projects, particularly for politicians. Plus various governance bodies such as OECD. It's very easy to demonstrate here and there the benefits of infrastructure investment. But unfortunately, there's less attention given to how you sweat existing assets and sunk investment in infrastructure and improve the asset and management. And this is particularly relevant whether you look at emerging nations or others. We need to look at long-run, whole-of-life asset management, not just the initial costs. There are shared interests. Why is it so seductive? There is shared interest amongst those that want to build, big construction companies, and the big financial institutions. And asset management is always a poor cousin. A poor cousin because it's much more complex, it's bits and pieces, it's much more visible because you know what's already happened and you know what you have to try and achieve and improve. So the accountability with sweating and managing an existing asset is far more difficult. But given the value of that sunk investment, it is critical when you're defining and even a build project to look at that ongoing asset management. Now, in Australia, for example, in 2005, we had all the business, industry and lobby groups saying we need more investment in infrastructure because of declining productivity, on the assumption that they were directly related. Yet, how many projects actually quantify what the effect is going to be on GDP? Not that many. We had, at that time, election of our Labor government after, at the Commonwealth level, after a Conservative Liberal government, and as well, many of the state government authorities at that time were also, or the state governments, were Labor governments. So you had a complete alignment in 2008 between Commonwealth and state. So that was a time when you could really achieve some major changes in infrastructure. So there was a big summit that Rudd, who was elected as Prime Minister, held, and I was one of the invitees to that summit in the Economics Forum. And the proposal was, well, let's get the Commonwealth government, because we had big surpluses at that time, to in fact participate much more directly with the states, because one of our problems in Australia is split between the Commonwealth state and the local government further down, but particularly Commonwealth and state, so we could get an alignment here. The GFC demonstrated very clearly when government asked state agencies, where do we spend our money on infrastructure, that they didn't have a pipeline of fully evaluated, ready projects to put before. So instead of having that investment go into economic infrastructure, it went into a whole range of schools, housing and other projects. Why? Primarily because we didn't have a ready pipeline of deeply and rigorously considered infrastructure projects to act as a counter-cyclical measure. Now, what also happened is, with the Commonwealth stepping in and asking the state governments for submissions for how they spend their money on infrastructure projects, because the Commonwealth had all this money, the problem was that at that time certain states were ready with submissions because they had a strong governance, and other states were not ready. And at that time, the chairman of the appointed Infrastructure Australia Council, Eddington, had already in Victoria prepared his report on Victorian transport. So certain states were ready. So when submissions were made in 2009 and the money spent amongst all those different agencies, the money went not to the states that were most in need, but those states that put forward justifiable propositions. So New South Wales, and I'll go into this a bit later, missed out. However, the interesting thing is that the infrastructure spend on, say, rail was around 6 billion, and transport all up 8.3. And they went through various analyses. However, the 43 billion compared with the 6 or 8 billion on transport did not have a full benefit cost or any deep financial evaluation. So the biggest spend had the least evaluation and has had subsequently the least disclosure. So here's a table that shows you the spend, and you can see here the national broadband, that project with 43 billion, right? 43,000 million is 43 billion, did not have full evaluation, was not referred to the body that was set up by the Commonwealth to step in and make sure that the decisions were well considered. So on the one hand, the states didn't get money because they didn't have ready submissions, but yet the Commonwealth Zone project was funded, notwithstanding the fact it didn't have that level of evaluation. So there are a few counterfactuals there. So productivity returns, how do we measure them? Well, typically, let's look at what is the basis for infrastructure spend. When you look at some of the work of OECD, when you look at some of the work of Infrastructure Australia, typically the argument is how much is each nation spending as a percentage of GDP on infrastructure. So in Australia, we spent in 2009 on economic and social infrastructure 6.8% of our GDP on infrastructure spend. In the OECD, it was 2.5, but that was only for economic infrastructure, and in fact that excluded ports and airports. So they're really not comparable. But when Infrastructure Australia did its appraisal, it used the fact that we were below the average trend line in spend amongst nations. I don't have the trend line, but this is the argument they used. Because we didn't spend quite as much as some other countries had spent, that's the reason why we should be spending more. That was the basic proposition. And I question the appropriateness of that type of analysis. In any instance, even if we say it's reasonable to say that each country should be spending X percent of GDP on infrastructure, in the Australian situation, industry bodies have said we've got a backlog of up to 700 billion. Well, however are we going to fund that from tax revenue? You cannot. Even over an 8-year period, you cannot fund that amount of infrastructure spend without involving the private sector. And that means you need to really look at the fundamentals of those projects you're putting forward, because you don't want projects being put forward where the private sector comes in, then fails because they're not feasible project, and who do you have at the end of the day but the government as the party taking the risk. And it's not the government, it's the taxpayer. So what is actually the evidence on returns? You know, what do we have to really make sure we're getting the evidence, as I said earlier? Very weak links. So what Luis Sebren and others have established by looking across hundreds of case studies, much more rigorous analysis than Alshore, is that what we're getting, even if we just look, if we look at the value of the assets, because a lot of the spend may not be good spend, so it doesn't actually improve the value of that asset. So a 10% increase in the asset value increases the GDP by figures of 0.7 to 1%, so it's not one-on-one. So if GDP, you know, contribution to GDP is the question, there's not much evidence to justify that. Plus, there's the question that arises, is there reverse causality? Namely, in the case of Australia, and I'll go on to this a bit further, is it infrastructure spend in our resources and energy sector that's driving the growth, or is it the price of commodities and infrastructure spend is just there to make sure that can be realised, not the other way around? We also have very limited empirical analysis and monitoring and accountability of ex ante, ex post. So even assuming we have really good analysis and consideration by decision makers when they're specifying a project and deciding to go ahead with it, there's actually very little mechanism for keeping them to account. We have Auditor General's reports and the like, and all they look at is, was the project on time and within budget? It doesn't look at the fundamentals of did it deliver the benefits net after cost and everything that it anticipated. What it looks at primarily is whether it was in typical project management terms, very narrowly, on time, in budget, and what were the cause of overruns. And we certainly, in terms of Australia, what Infrastructure Australia is the body that was set up by the Commonwealth Government to step in and allocate money across states from Commonwealth surpluses. What they've relied on are reports from Institute of Engineers on the quality of the assets. And that assessment by the Institute of Engineers in Australia just says good, medium, fair, poor. And it's quality of the assets, not return on those assets. So I think there is a very significant research agenda if we're to properly inform our decision makers. Infrastructure in a two-speed economy. Australia has a two-speed economy, one around the commodities area, commodities, mining and energy, and in the mining area particularly iron ore, and in the energy area particularly now around unconventional gas, around fracking, etc., which is very much around the northern arc of Australia, whereas our other economies, the southeast seaboard, are much more the financial sector, service industry and the like. So we have two very different economies operating. Yet, some very good work has been done by the Productivity Commission, which is a national body, because there's been a debate where people are saying we need more protection for these other industries and the like, where the Productivity Commission has stepped in and said, look, here are the real flow-through consequences of the whole resources and energy boom. This is how it improves our balance of trade. This is how it improves the situation for Australian taxpayers. And this is why we should make structural adjustments to promote that investment in the resources and energy market and not become protective. So there's a very good piece of work that was done by the Productivity Commission to get rid of these sectoral or stakeholder interests moving towards protectionism. And that's what I'm suggesting is the sort of work we need to do much more in the research area so that we can better inform politicians of consequences of alternative actions, rather than saying, oh, this is political, rather than should have been based on other criteria. So in Australia, what is extraordinary is that this year, for the first time in our history since I think about 89, the percentage of our GDP from mining investment exceeds the percentage in non-mining. You know, where, say, you know, the graph has just turned over compared with. And it's been to the great benefit of Australia because even our southeast seaboard cities and economies that rely very much on the financial sector. We had strong regulatory environment, our banks were strong, our debts were relatively low. We had a bad time in the 80s and 90s, and so we fixed ourselves up. And so we, notwithstanding a two-speed economy, Australia is in a very strong position at the moment in terms of the resources and the structural adjustments that are occurring there, and as well the financial sector. But the transformation in terms of mega projects is extraordinary in Northern Australia, where with the iron ore projects, areas such as the Pilbara are suddenly massively changing. Massive changes to regional centres and development. Governments responding by giving them, by redistributing back to those areas royalties, money, to improve the condition of the townships and the infrastructure there. And so there's a great change around Pilbara and the iron ore. In the case of Queensland, there's also a great change there with the unconventional gas, where economies that were previously agricultural economies, it's almost like industrialisation in the UK, you know, centuries ago, where the whole landscape has changed and it's moving from an agricultural landscape to an industrial landscape around the whole drilling, pipelines, coal seam, methane gas extraction. The big issue in these northern areas facing the regulator who's there to determine access and price regimes, because infrastructure is a collective good, is that third-party access to infrastructure. For example, BHP contested whether FMG, which is another mining company, should have access to its rail infrastructure, because it argued it had taken risk. That is in the courts and for appeal and will continue to be contested. So the big issue is if you start off with infrastructure and then you try and give access to other third parties, that is likely to be contested, and the role of the regulator is very critical, and the role of the courts and the legal system is also very critical. The one thing we also found recently, when the government proposed a mining tax, that a lot of companies came back and said you can't apply it to existing mining projects because that will be retrospective, and we've made our existing investment decisions based on that. So any infrastructure, the critical thing is not to change the rules from the financier's point of view after the fact. Now, the problem we had when the Infrastructure Australia was established with all its surpluses is that, as I said previously, that the submissions made by state governments for that money were typically old projects rebundled, except for Victoria, that had the benefit of the Eddington report, and Eddington was also the chairman of Infrastructure Australia Council. So, good governance, and in Victoria, he was there before he was appointed chairman, to know the sort of work that needed to be done on network. At least Victoria was more ready than the other states. However, I question whether readiness is the right criteria for determining infrastructure spend when you don't know whether that will crowd out being able to spend money on more needy infrastructure in the next round of funding. So the variability of state submissions. Here, as I've said, I won't elaborate. Victoria was well prepared. Queensland was also reasonably well prepared because it had a whole history of good governance under the Coordinator General, Sid Schubert, for over 30 years, different people came in. So it had a very good strategic approach. On the other hand, Western Australia was less reliant because it had the resources boom, but New South Wales was really the poor state. New South Wales lacked a centre in terms of governance, so its Labor government for many years had been, in recent years, criticised by various parties as a basket case. There was an electoral backswing and a Liberal government, a Liberal Conservative government came in, and the great tragedy for New South Wales was that it did not have ready projects to put up when Commonwealth had a surplus to spend, so New South Wales essentially missed out. And then after the allocation was made in 2009, there were no longer the surpluses as the GFC unveiled that the Commonwealth had anticipated. So, what we need is a more strategic, holistic approach before we get into project selection, and we need ex-post monitoring after the event and feedback in terms of holding politicians and also those preparing the feasibility, benefit, cost and other analyses. There is a different type of evaluation that we need to do when we're looking at infrastructure, which is networks and systems models, compared with the traditional project evaluation models such as cost-benefit analysis. And there's a lot of interesting work being undertaken by the Smart Infrastructure Centre that I'm on the board of, using agent-based modelling that help in developing and defining projects before you get to a final project definition and then evaluation. The project evaluation, I believe cost-benefit analysis or CBRs, cost-benefit ratios, are, in my opinion and practice, far too aggregated to really reveal what lies beneath the surface, and to hold those preparing them, as well as the politicians acting on them, to account. That basically, back in the 1970s and 80s, where I was involved in the major airport needs for Sydney, and I did the disaggregated benefit cost analysis for that, that revealed the initial impacts in terms of who were the winners and losers amongst all the different stakeholders, then how different areas, geographies were affected, those benefits and costs were distributed, and then ultimately how that affected the overall income contribution and redistribution of income amongst households. Now, what I also did in that analysis is look at how I could aggregate that to different electorates, Labor, Liberal, swinging seats. I went to the state and federal government at that time, and that's decades ago, and they said, "Thank you very much, Sonja. This is very interesting, we need to know this, but the electoral stuff we're not going to put on public record." So the question is, how do we get more transparency and disclosure to go beneath the surface of aggregated benefit cost analysis and to assist the decision makers? Because the decision makers, the politicians, are making decisions on how does it affect our electorate? How are they going to know what affects their electorate? They know that by having a focus group. Is that sufficient? No, it certainly is not. So unless we go beneath the surface of the traditional evaluation methods, we will not be able to either inform political decision makers, nor will we be able to hold those who prepared that evaluation and the decision makers to account, even if we have ex post monitoring of the findings. You will never be able to do it with just aggregate. Oh, it's much more difficult to get beneath the surface, other than just looking at certain areas of bias, etc., that underpin benefit cost analysis. And you can look at that yourselves if you care to look at the Senate or your committee reports on HS2. You know, you can't really see who were the winners and losers and how the aggregate was derived. At least I couldn't in my reading of it the other night. So we have more limited evaluation, in fact, in Australia in mega projects, namely the broadband, 43 billion, that we have in the smaller projects. Now, these are the sort of benefit-cost ratios, and this is what we get in terms of disclosure. So, you can see here that if you look at that table, A is for national managed motorways. So that's improving the motorways, comes up to 4 billion. Then C, Metro 1, that was the Eddington report, the first recommendation, stage 1, 4 billion, so they got their share of it. But what was their benefit cost ratio? 1.3. There's very little margin for error there. If your BCR is only 1.3, even if you accept BCR as a sufficient basis. Then we go, well, what was the next big biggie? 7, the highway upgrade. Again, 1.5 BCR. So when you look at it, a lot of the big spends have not much room for error in the BCRs, let alone looking underneath the BCR itself in terms of who are the initial winners and losers, which were the geographic areas or the localities that won or lost, or who are the taxpayers and the productivity of the nation and how that actually benefited. Now, if you look at Infrastructure Australia's list there of additional projects, and I've just pulled out the ones over 3 billion, they've got estimates of costs, but no numbers that are on public record at the moment of the benefit cost ratio. So I'm not sure when I'm asked to talk about what the transformational benefits are to the nation and the region, because I don't believe we have the information to demonstrate that, the evidence. I'm sure it's there in one way or another, but to know how it's the magnitude in terms of contribution to productivity, to know how it's distributed amongst different areas, I don't think there's sufficient evidence. So, if we look back at announcements, our Minister, our Commonwealth Minister, the focus, again, why is infrastructure so seductive? Because you're talking about big numbers that really can make men's blood boil. You know, really big numbers. So everyone loves a big number. Henry Ergas, who has written widely and is the professor in the Smart Infrastructure Centre on economic evaluation, said when he inquired into national broadband and some highways, project evaluation only as good as the governments for which it is done, and is only sustained if governments see value in it. I'd go a step further and say that's partly true, but the other part of it is that those firms, governments, or bureaucracies that are doing the evaluation also do not properly inform the politicians. That there is something basically lacking in how we go beneath the surface of our typical studies. And that lessons learned, I don't believe we have really, in Australia, learnt our lessons. For example, when we were trying to decide where to locate Second Sydney Airport, which has a location Bridge, and that was reserved after whatever the merit of the benefit cost analyses and other investigations were. Yet the government overturned it and said, no, we're not going to now reserve that site. So one government reserved it and the next one set it aside. High-speed rail, we've been talking about that in Australia for over 30 years. Still haven't worked out the feasibility of it. It'll be interesting to see what the benefit-cost ratio is, probably around 1.3, 1.5, given all the rest of them are around that number. And it's interesting to note that, again, the IPA, which is our peak industry group, and the consultant it worked with actually proposed government that they look at high-speed rail. Then that same consultant was appointed to do the evaluation for stage 1, and there was going to be a contest amongst consultancies as to who does stage 2 evaluation, and it's the same consultant again. Now, I don't know what lies beneath the surface of the evaluation. I can only see the process. Transformational effect of nationally significant infrastructure. I think that there is, as I say here, limited, systematic and comprehensive evidence of positive causality. Agglomerative economies and measuring those are used selectively in our transport studies, in all sorts of studies. They will say this area is the beneficiary, but we don't look at the redistributive effect. NBN, well, as I said, back to this date, we have not had full disclosure of the analysis on that. And in terms of our own evaluation, I think we have failed professionally to really go beneath the surface and demonstrate to politicians who are the winners and losers, and the sequential flow-through of redistributive effects and whether it contributes to the national productivity or not. So, the challenge. Our regulatory reform is very slow. So, on the one hand, we've been allocating money to build, but the regulatory reform, particularly in relation to creating an infrastructure market, creating a market where prices are set at a reasonable level, so both government and private sector can invest. I think that's the area that remains challenging in Australia. Also, we still have issues around rigidities associated with labour and the unions, particularly in the rail sector, and there are significant savings we could be making in states such as New South Wales, but because of rigidities in the market, we're not able to make them. The regulators, again, there are questions around what type of pricing and how they set the pricing, and we need to look at that. And privatisation or PPPs or whatever, again, I think there are, we need to move closely, but maybe privatisation could be a better step than, in certain instances, a PPP, because at least if you privatise, the private sector has to take the gain and the loss, both. Whereas in a PPP, you've got a lot more exposure potentially of the taxpayer. And I'm not sure what our approach should be, and without the evaluation and the post hoc evidence, it's very difficult to make those judgments. Institutional innovation. Now, the Commonwealth Government stepped in Australia and has developed guidelines at a national level for harmonising PPP contracts. It's developed some investment and reform principles. It's developed some national frameworks. Interestingly, those national frameworks weren't available at the time the Commonwealth went to our states for submissions. In other words, when the state governments were asked to put in their bids for monies, the Commonwealth did not have a national framework. And the national frameworks that exist now, what they really are is a statement of intent saying the state should prepare a state framework fitting in with the national. So still there's not that substance that you would expect. The New South Wales government, which was so derelict in its duties in relation to infrastructure, in my opinion, has now set up New South Wales infrastructure in the legislation. However, the problem is that there were pre-election promises made before Infrastructure New South Wales was set up. So even though you have a body set up that's supposed to look very carefully at all the different strategies over 25 years, etc., in fact, you've already precluded certain of those because of election promises. The election promises were North West and South West Rail, electricity privatisation and the like, which mean that a lot of the money New South Wales can expect to get has already been allocated to those projects and won't be available for others. Electricity privatisation, even though benefit cost and other analyses had said it would probably be better to bundle all the assets together, the distribution and all the other aspects, we've separated them because of the pre-election promise. So there's still an issue here. But at least New South Wales legislation has now said we need to have a 20-year infrastructure strategy. Mind you, this is a Conservative government that's saying this, which is counter to the approach in the UK, which is saying let's get out of planning. Here is a state, which is the equivalent of a region, saying this is what we need. So it said a 20-year state infrastructure strategy, and it has to be adopted by the Premier, and it specifies very clearly what must be included in that. So what I like about this is that there is a clear specification of what is to be prepared and what may be prepared. So notwithstanding the pre-election promise, at least it's bound in legislation, and the question is, do we have the evaluation mechanisms, do we have the post hoc accountability and reviews to inform that decision making so you update these strategies? In my opinion, if we're to develop and engage the private sector, it is absolutely critical that there is very detailed strategy and project evaluation in the pipeline of projects we come up with in Australia. Because if we put up poor projects, they're going to fail. They're going to be white elephants, as have a number of projects in New South Wales been. So in New South Wales, as well as Queensland, certain projects that were PPPs, such as Cross City Tunnel, such as the Lake Cove Tunnel, and in Queensland there was also another, I think it was Clem Jones or another tunnel, have all fallen over. And white elephants were built under PPPs, and the taxpayer will suffer as a consequence. We need to develop mechanisms where if the private sector comes up with a non-conforming bid to a project that actually delivers better outcomes, that the authority or the entity making the decision about that bid should consider non-conforming bids and allow the IP from that bid without re-tendering to be retained. Now that presumes that there is a real competence in the government bodies reviewing the different bids. We need to reduce bid costs and the complexity and avoid retrospectivity and regulations and taxes. It's important to enhance competition because, as I said at the outset, in my view, a lot of infrastructure is not a public good per se. It is in fact the good that can be, is a collective good and could be as much provided by the private sector as the public sector. And for those where there are significant externalities, they can be regulated as regulated assets, but it's absolutely important how a price is set by the regulator. But we need to have competition in terms of embedded project management teams and systems coming into government and strengthening government in terms of its ability. Outsourcing PPPs, local enterprise partnerships, where there is local ownerships of collective goods, and privatisation of certain assets as well. So one size doesn't fit all. We need to look at fit-for-purpose mechanisms. Importantly, we need to look at how we sweat existing assets and enhance our services and improve demand management, particularly through giving them a reasonable price signal, because that will encourage the development of an infrastructure market. And most importantly, rather than getting into the detail in contracts of the engineering side, so you can cap costs, because as I said at the outset, most people or auditor generals are concerned with how do you cap, how do you monitor costs? Did it come in cost? Did it come in time? No, it should be more about service and performance outcomes, and there should be mechanisms for risk-reward sharing. And most importantly, if we're to align the politics with productivity, we need different measures and go beneath the surface of traditional benefit cost analysis, which in Australia we're very reliant on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry about the extent.
Music to the Omega Centre's ears, for sure, but it may not be music to other people's ears. Comments, questions? Rob?
Yeah, I think you make some very good points, like the state of readiness and things like that in the UK, where the infrastructure plan was pushed together. It was a stimulus spending package, and you tend to get the projects that are well developed going there, and it tends to be the highway projects because that's essentially well organised in the UK. So I agree with that stuff, but I think it's an important point. But I think more important is how you perceive the role of cost-benefit analysis and how it should be used and where it should be used in the process. And if it's as it's used at the moment, it tends to be the first part of the process. So if anything falls out, it gives you a low CBA, which is 1 or just over 1, then it doesn't go through the process. And you mentioned a couple of projects, one high-speed rail at a 1.3, and then more interestingly broadband. Whereas I would say it's irrelevant whether they have a low CBA. They should be invested in for other objectives, only picked up by goals achievements or criteria analysis, like broadband is critical for Australia, for international competitiveness, social inclusion, lots of stuff that is not captured within a narrow CBA. And the same for high-speed rail, it might have a low CBA, but so what, that's only 5% of the argument. It's more connecting cities together, etc., etc. So I think that's my main issue with your sort of take, is how you use CBA and what else it should be used with.
My view is that CBA, just as a rounded number, is totally inadequate for decision making. That at 1.3, it already shows it's a risky project in terms of error. However, we still need to go under the surface to find out, by using disaggregated benefit cost analysis and models, as to how different stakeholders government, government business enterprises, private companies, etc. First round of impacts are affected. Then localities, how are the benefits in terms of agglomerative economies redistributed? So we understand the number, we understand how it's distributed, and then we also understand how it flows through ultimately in terms of income and well-being and growth. So I in fact agree with what you're saying, that CBA at a low number is not what we should be using, and I'm saying whether it's low or high is inadequate because we cannot see what lies beneath it, and particularly if we're looking at long-term projects, how do we know? What we know is typically that costs go up, time runs out, and benefits keep decreasing. But we don't really know how the agglomerative economies, these second-order effects, are distributed. And in cost-benefit analysis, I do not know whether, for example, because I haven't interrogated in sufficient detail the UK HS2, whether it has looked at net agglomerative economies. Which are the regions that win, that lose, the redistributional effects, whether it's jobs or whatever? Has it involved double counting? To what degree? What are the elasticities?
Yeah, I think that's the disaggregated CBA would be useful, but I also that will suffer the problem that it only looks at monetized effects, and it could be the externalities that are a lot more important for society in the long term than a narrow angle view of CBA. So I think we need to think how you fit CBA within a wider appraisal process, and this is Harry and others in Amiga thinking through this process as well, but also to what strength of argument we give CBA within the appraisal, and at the moment it leads to a certain type of schemes being invested in, because we hold too much store in that number.
And what I believe is missing is that CBA, and I refer to wider CBA, so that it includes agglomerative economies and externalities, even though it might monetise them, but it includes those, come in at the project evaluation. What we're not doing is determining and using broader evaluations such as agent-based modelling and systems analysis, including the discursive multivariate analysis that Harry is referring to in our network for systems analysis, that the part that's really weak is this part, the front end. And unfortunately, strategic planning, which should be about infrastructure planning systems, has been, or the way it's perceived by politicians, is that regional planning is about dots and circles, because traditionally it's been, this is the physical form, rather than systems analysis, and really developing much more rigorous evaluation mechanisms at this front end of the network and systems models. So I think if we had better project development and definition emerging out of the understanding of the network, then the CBA could be an AOK method as long as we still inquire beneath the surface. Yeah. But you just can't go straight, here is the project, because it just depends on whose pet scheme comes in.
Yeah, there needs to be an initial stage, which is assessment against MCA. If it gets through that, then it goes through CBA, possibly, but also be careful about the definition and what it's actually measuring.
And I would say even before MCA, that because infrastructure is about a network, it must be a network analysis to work out well, how do we best allocate money to get the return we want, whether it's services or productivity, and then apply your multi-criteria analysis not to a project but to a network. And I think where we're missing is thinking about network, because let's quickly get and build the project that's due. And at a critical time in the economy, I think we should be thinking of how we spend rather than just getting out there and spending, because it's sunk investment.
I think there's a considerable anti-political assumption in your approach. It seems to be very technocratic. And what really bothers me here is the implications for democratic accountability, in the sense that parties should be declaring what they're going to do. So to say that, for example, the government in New South Wales has made promises and then later on these impinge on what might happen with a future planning sort of process. I mean, those are promises which people are elected on. So election is the vital process here, and actually knowing what people plan to do is part of that process. So trying to, one of the things you talk about in this biography here is about building cross-party, bipartisan consensus in order to reduce political risk, which I think is highly undesirable, actually. I think there should be political risk. And that if you eliminate this, you actually damage your decision-making process, which should require controversy. So a lot of the projects that you talk about are controversial. Privatisation is very controversial. So it doesn't have automatic benefits, as I'm sure you would have said, but it is a political program from a particular section of the political geography and the political arena. So if you treat this as being something where we should be trying to create bipartisan approaches, then I think you actually damage the democratic process. And there are plenty of bipartisan projects which people have, which go on all the time. Like, for example, in Britain, we have nuclear. Nuclear is developed for, not just for power generation, but also because of security and defence interests. And so both parties support that, regardless, have supported it for a long time. That bipartisanship is virtually unchallengeable. And so if you create this bipartisanship, you actually, I think, very severely undermine the democratic process. And the second thing I'd like to comment was your comment about industrialisation, what you said about what's happening in Northern Australia. I don't really know a great deal about what's happening in Northern Australia, but in terms of land rights, for example, for Indigenous peoples, Aboriginals, this has been a very controversial issue all over the world. And what we're talking about here is a continuation of the process of colonisation, whereby land has been seized by people, taken over, and then turned into a new state, and the original land rights of those people will be taken away. So if you continue that process now, you are overriding those land rights. Now, it may be that states have started to hand back or started to recognise some of those land rights, but essentially you're continuing a situation in which the group of people has been marginalised over a very long period of time and have sunk right to the bottom of the pile in most societies. So those people get almost no benefits as it stands at the moment, apart from the fact that now some money may start to turn back in terms of schools and clinics. But essentially they have been completely marginalised. And that, in terms of what happened in Britain, because you referred to Britain's industrialisation, happened here as well, which was that there was mass migration of people who were basically kicked off their land, land was enclosed, and they became the urban poor and lived in slums for decades, as you could say they still do. So I think, again, that there's a kind of an assumption about what is in the national interest, but what is the definition in that instance of the nation? Are these other groups actually part of this idea of the nation?
Okay. Firstly, I don't agree with your conclusion that providing transparency and going beneath the surface of whatever evaluation you undertake, cost-benefit analysis or whatever, and holding governments to account on the basis of that information is anti-democratic. I think it's essential to have information, to have informed political debate. What I am saying is that it's only if you do have access to the numbers and the redistributive effects beneath the surface of, say, benefit cost analysis, that you can hold politicians to account and at least have the opportunity for a bipartisan support, if there is to be that. But without transparency and going beneath the surface, you will never have a democratic process. So that was the proposition I was putting forward.
I'm also not coming against.
No, I'm saying that's, and so it's not a technocratic approach. It's saying the rounding of numbers and putting it together and me not having a number, to my mind, and going to an election with a promise and an electorate that is not informed, that essential to democracy is revealing information to the electorate, to hold politicians to account. And in my view, we as professionals have been derelict in our duty to provide sufficient disaggregation, contestability, and push for the release of that information in the public domain. So when governments go out and make political commitments, and it's based on that electorate not being as informed as it might be of what are the issues for it, I think that is anti-democratic. Now, in relation to the question of industrialisation, again, what I'm saying there, the overall benefit in terms of the Productivity Commission's report on the gains from the resources and mining boom, I'm also saying that we need to identify incidence analysis, who are the winners and losers in that process, because it's only if you identify them that you have other government mechanisms stepping in to compensate those that are losers, if they're third parties. Now, in the question of land rights, that's not something that Australia has only addressed that in recent years, as you and others would know. And certainly the land rights are not just limited to Indigenous population. The big contest with particularly coal seam methane gas for the farmers, and whether the farmers, because of the legislation we have, are being fairly compensated for their loss of entitlement to their above grade or at grade land. And that's a major issue. And certainly environmental impact studies don't look at that. So again, whether it's environmental impact studies or cost-benefit analyses that are done, there is no mechanism for looking under the surface. And when private investment is made in, say, resources-related infrastructure, the test is FIRB, if it's foreign investment, so it goes to the Foreign Investment Review Board. Nationally, it becomes a political decision as to whether, through EISs, whether they approve a project or not. Now, my other view is that I cannot see why we have environmental impact assessment separate from benefit cost analysis, or I would say disaggregated wider benefit cost analysis. And you should be wrapping up the whole lot so that the electorate and the decision maker are both well informed, and third parties can hold them to account after the event. So I'm not suggesting a technocratic approach, but rather informing the electorate.
Yeah, I certainly agree with this information, but I think that the implications of the process do tend to lead to a technocratic approach, because if you are, like for example with the case you cited in New South Wales, you create something after the event and you already have some promises. The whole point is that debate, isn't it? Is how people are going to follow up on the promises that have been made. I mean, in the case of privatisation in Britain, for example, privatisation was not actually promised. It was something which happened after the event. It was something which the Thatcher government sort of picked up on as a possible solution to some of its financial woes. So it started selling off national assets. And I mean, a lot of this is just state of hand. I think you're going to have a lot of difficulty here overcoming the political constraints, which is why I think that looking at this as being something which you can present as being kind of known results, I just don't think it works like that, because so PFI is another case. I mean, the Tory government said it wasn't going to continue with PFI. It now finds it's quite useful to it because it's having its problems with its budget, so it actually wants to continue investing. Exactly. So, but this is a way in which they're concealing their spending, because this is what they're going to go on doing all the time. I mean, I entirely agree with you that it's down to academics to criticise this and to present it, but I don't really see it as possible to create this kind of aura of bipartisanship, and you're going to get these perfect projects, because that is always going to be part of a political argument. And maybe I'm overstating what you're saying, but I think there's a tendency here to look at it like that. To me, academics are critics, and they can point out how the thing isn't working. But to then see themselves as part of the process of decision making, I think is a different business, because that's where you get into the necessary argument, which reflects different interests, because and that is a battle, it's a political battle, it's a power struggle, and those things are going to happen. And in terms of compensation, it's a power struggle as well. People are not compensated. They're never compensated. Compulsory purchase never produces decent compensation. So these are struggles which are going on, which are never going to be eliminated by kind of these benefit analysis. All that the benefit analysis can do, which I certainly think it has a function, is to produce criticisms of what is happening, how it's been done, what has happened, and to show that something was not done properly. But I'm sceptical you're going to get any further than that. I think inserting into the decision-making process may be harmful. So maybe I'm overstating what you're saying, but that's what I'm anxious about. And I think that, for example, you seem quite supportive of what's happening in North Australia. And I would say that
productivity.
No, okay, right, okay, fine. Yes, but you see, then you say that, but then that would be interpreted by a lot of people as being supportive. So then other people say, well, that's actually nothing to do with me at all. I'm just here and I'm suffering the consequences of this. It doesn't make a difference whether the national product is improving, because I'm never going to get anything out of this.
So that's a question of the incidence analysis. So I don't talk about cost-benefit analysis alone. I say cost-benefit and incidence analysis. Why cost-benefit? Plus, I think academics have, in my view, a bigger part to play, not in decision-making, and not limited to criticism, because they'll be perceived always to criticise but never come up with anything. So the challenge is how to be both independently critical, independent in terms of mind, and also come up with different tools, approaches. And that's where I believe it's not academics being part of the decision-making process, but academics also unravelling through their criticism the development of approaches that will provide better information to the electorate, to the decision-maker and the electorate. And what is the electorate interested in? Am I a winner or a loser? And when? And how am I going to be compensated? And I don't believe that we, in the academic area, have done sufficient work either to provide a body of evidence in terms of monitoring what is going on, nor do I believe we've done sufficient in terms of really looking at how we can get to the underpinnings of better tools.
But I think you probably agree that there is a real danger of co-option, which is that inevitably, when you become an actor in this, you also people start trying to turn your work to their advantage, and I mean, politicians do that, and campaign groups will do that. But on top of that, there's the seduction, which is in the process of then also becoming one of the players, so that you do move from being someone who, because I'm still a bit reluctant, I don't have a problem with the idea of something a critic and not a composer. I know, you're just negative. get it. Negativity is very good because actually it takes a fight.
I'm saying it's the body
yeah,
of academics, so it's one thing for, I think...
But then academics can be incorporated, and they find that their departments are asked to become part of the process of making something happen. And I mean, and that's happening very much in British universities, I would say, where actually a lot of companies are set up to get involved in finding ways of exploiting their expertise, and they become part of the process as well, rather than just be critics.
The risk in academe, in my view, is around funding. That you get your money for doing or coming to a particular outcome. And the way to address that is to make sure you have sufficient separation and diversity of funding sources. Because once you get, and having been a consultant for 40 years, and knowing how the system works, I agree with you that the real challenge for academia is to remain independently minded, critical, help inform and develop systems and tools, but also avoid how the time and money to research to a particular outcome. And that is the thing. Therefore, what I suppose with the Smart Infrastructure Centre that I'm on the board of, the interesting thing about that is that while the Commonwealth funds money for that, on the board you've got all different political persuasions in terms of government representatives. You have both practitioners and academics, etc. And so you have a top cover that would preclude, because if anyone's getting, you know, their own agenda, you've got that top cover. So much is about the governance. You can't legislate for good government. We all know that. So how do we inform so things are contested? And I think it's a difficult one. Thank you.
I have a number of points. I quickly followed after you completed your presentation with a fully supportive statement, and the music for our ears, I think I said something like that. It's music to the ears of the researchers at the Omega Centre, insofar as we have evidence coming out of our ears that cost-benefit analysis ain't fit for purpose in terms of what it claims to do, or what some people claim it to do. So I think in that regard, we're fully on board with your conclusions. John and I have been preparing some lectures, and also Rob as well, on cost-benefit analysis, because not that we believe in it, but it's important that our students that come out of our course have an understanding of its strengths and limitations. And we in preparing lectures, get educated as well. And in so doing, it's, I mean, John's read a bit more, maybe Rob too, but the reading I've done, you go back to missions work in the 1970s, makes a very point that you don't, you know, CBA is not really up to the job of looking at distributive impact. You should keep the two separate. So I actually wouldn't support the idea of bringing cost-benefit analysis and having the distributive or the equitable. I think that Mission was right. You know, cost-benefit analysis does a certain task for the stakeholders that are interested in rates of return, whatever it is. That, I think, as we were implying before, needs to be put in a place where there are other assessment frameworks. That's my first point. The second point is, I wish you were right that academics really, I mean, you didn't say they don't influence, they don't have an impact, but they don't respond. Alan Walters was one of the most influential, and for me, one of the most damaging academic economists who became influential in the World Bank and introduced the line of the railways, you know, having the railway line separate. So, the Washington Consensus is full of ex-academics who've translated their academic ideology into frameworks. So in a way, I think we academics are more dangerous than we don't just criticise, we actually put models in the marketplace, which then, I remember interviewing Robert Mitchell, who wrote the seminal book on land use transport planning, and he was a housing specialist, a land use planner, and he said the model that we set up on land use transport interaction, it was totally commodified by the engineers and economists to a degree of unrecognized. I didn't say that, and yet they went like this. You still got the four-stage model today, and the very architects of those ideas have had their ideas translated into and packaged into ways where industry can benefit. So there are good examples and bad examples. I'll give you the other. I know the guy's passed away now, but I hope you won't mind me talking badly of him. So I think they're just. I mean, I couldn't. What's really, really comforting, because we've met just a couple of times, is how much synergy. I think John, you know, you can see this, and I can't believe that this knowledge is all new. No disrespect to you or me. I believe this knowledge has been known. In fact, I know it's been known because when we interviewed one of the biggest companies in this field, how is it that these lessons, that cost-benefit analysis ain't really the trick? The response was, well, we do learn lessons, but we actually keep the lessons for our own internal use. Knowledge is a commodity.
I think.
Yeah, and they don't want, I'm sure they know CBA doesn't work.
That's why it's the role of government to hold them to account.
But then when you rely on government, and my final point, when you rely on government, which is what's happening, we're now going to the Chinese Sovereign Wealth Fund, when you rely on government to rely on private investment because they don't have it, and with these private investments come other conditionalities, we're back to square one. You're right, it's up to governments, but we're placing so much attention here in the UK on finance and elsewhere, with the conditionalities that come with it, that looking at our press, I'm sorry, it's an Australian gentleman, as you may know the guy's name, Mr. Murdoch, he had this relationship where his power and influence is so much needed. And my fear is that the more we need private, you made the point earlier, the more the infrastructure agenda is expanded and expanded, the shorter the public's going to be of money. And then the more dependent we are on the private sector. And then the less transparent becomes the information. So you and I think, coming from the same point, we want transparency. But the more money you take from the private sector, the less transparency you get. Am I wrong?
I think if you go into I don't know the answer to that, but I would postulate that in the halfway area of PPPs is the murky area. That if you privatise, then it's transparent and you can see what happens to that asset and the share price and everything. In a PPP, things are renegotiated, certain clauses, conditions are commercial in confidence, so you never see into them what the detail of the contract was. So again, PPP, certain ones in Australia have been disastrous. Is that just across city tunnel? And I don't believe that privatisation per se, if you make the boundary clear, offers less transparency. I think it's where certain information isn't released because it's commercially in confidence in a PPP, whereas if it is fully privatised, then you've got very clear rules of disclosure in terms of public private corporations and listed companies, certainly in Australia. I don't know what the case is in the UK, I imagine it's fairly much the same, but there is a legal requirement and penalties and everything for non-disclosure. And that's a very strong area. But in the PPP, we have found in Australia on certain projects it's hard to get disclosure and there are lock-ins. For example, on the railway link in between Sydney and the airport, there's a lock-in where that party has a first right of refusal on any extensions or where you have to come back into Central Railway. So there's a lock-in pathway there. Now, if that had been completely privatised or whatever, there would be disclosure of that. For example, we know, in a whole lot of areas, if it's completely privatised, the government regulator, competition regulator, public disclosure laws are far more stringent than I believe in the PPP area.
I think I would dispute that. I think really, take for example when industries were privatised in Britain.
I don't know about Britain.
Yeah, but I'll give an example. It's water industry. One of the things which people didn't really seem to understand when private companies took over the water industries was that actually they had an enormous amount of land locked up with them. And the companies that took over these water companies then sold off enormous amounts of land and made a fantastic profit out of the development, which no one had really thought, well, when I say no one, it wasn't a matter of discussion at the time as to why these companies were so interested in acquiring these water companies. And a lot of companies have hidden assets which are not actually disclosed when privatisation occurs. So you end up with profits which were never anticipated, and the share price, which was undervalued when it was sold, shoots up, which happened in, I think, in every single case in Britain. And you find the company was considerably undervalued. So, I mean, there's enormous bias now against the idea of public ownership and nationalisation. It just doesn't occur. But actually, plenty of nationalised entities did work perfectly well. The entire structure of telephones and so on, which BT2 was created by the post office and was then made into a separate company and was then sold on as a separate entity. I don't think that these things are properly assessed, and somebody wants to make some money quickly, the government in that case wanted to make some money quickly, it just sold it off. So I don't think this is even really particularly thought out, and whether there's now such a bias against the idea of public ownership that it's almost impossible to present it as being a viable option, and yet lots of countries have made these entities work. And of course, if with the greater transparency which now occurs, and I'm not arguing that it's perfect at all, but say with freedom of information and so on, and political accountability, it is possible actually in some ways to look more closely at public entities than private entities, which, although they may be transparent in some respects, they hide under commercial sensitivity, commercial confidentiality. Yeah, exactly. And so actually a lot of its activities are not able to be found. And of course, the whole financial crack-up, failure, has been built around the fact that nobody knew really what the banks were doing. The banks actually didn't even know what they were doing themselves. And the regulators didn't understand what they were up to. And so the world economy is now falling apart.
Can I just quickly ask you one final question very quickly? To what extent do you think, have you read Malcolm Gladwell's book on tipping point? Did you read it?
Yes.
Yeah. This idea of contagion, and if we just apply this contagion dimension to ideas and concepts, do you think that the opposition, for example, against now nationalisation of utilities, or the PPP being increasingly adopted everywhere and anywhere, the Chinese are doing everywhere, or cost-benefit analysis being the basis and fundamentals by which we judge infrastructure. To what extent do you think their influence is a contagion factor of the kind that Gladwell, lazy governments and lazy professionals, or do you think it's a well-orchestrated, more Machiavellian strategy where people actually know cost-benefit analysis, but they actually there's an industry behind it which makes it work. So would you consider the contagion argument that the same with banking? That people thought it was a good idea, so they just took it on board. The same with PPPs. They don't
I
really.
think there is, and this is an observation without, evidence, but certainly if you look at when government or anyone takes a decision, they look at precedents. And if something has happened before and it's going well, it follows, so that there's that contagion inherent. But there's also the matter, I believe, of self-interest. Like there are certain parties, so I don't think, what I'm saying is it's not mutually exclusive. They're both contagion as well as strategic, purpose.
Yeah.
So I think for one group they may be lazy, but then there's another group that is very strategic and know where they want to get, and that's what they pursue. And it's the coincidence of both those that causes the outcomes. So government wants projects off balance sheet. It likes to announce big promises. Certain interest groups, as I said, this is the seductive power of infrastructure. Construction companies, we want to build, because we'll put in equity. That equity up front is part of what they take out the other end. Yes, they come in that budget. That's probably because they price in more than if the government had built it. But there is also evidence of government failure. So, and you've got the banks. They certainly want a deal flow. But again, it is government and governance is the key, because if you have lazy or less than competent government, it will come up with a pipeline that is not the best use of the taxpayer dollar. And the interest groups will pursue that pipeline because that's what's put up, and the taxpayer is the one that suffers, and the electorate, not just the taxpayer, the electorate.
Sonja, thank you ever so much. I mean, I think that's been extremely helpful, because having messages from the other side of the world, where basically we can see how these ideas transfer globally, and actually have some of the responses may well be closer than we think, at least in the geographic. Yeah. Thanks very much.